Hello everyone, my name is Anika Angriman, and today for my thesis defense I will be talking about architecture as a weapon of social and political control in dictatorships. This study goes over various totalitarian regimes of the Spanish-speaking world. First of all, let's start with the essence of architecture. This is a quote from German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, where he pretty much says that all the most powerful men have always inspired architects, and that architects are always being under the suggestion of power. An interpretation of this is that architecture is definitely one of the most obvious products of a certain society, and they also are observable traits of the psychology and ethos of those societies. It is also a perfect means to exert power over a society, and that's exactly why it was used as an instrument of social and political control by many dictatorships. Architecture is also the description of the physical space in all the literary works. It's also important to note that architects do translate perspectives and ideas of a certain society into buildings. Today, for this thesis defense, I will be mostly talking about totalitarian architectures, which are the architecture of regimes and dictatorships. Regimes and dictatorships are governments that do not permit any personal or individual freedom, and that try to subordinate every single aspect of individual life to the authority of the government. This term was first utilized by Italian dictator Benito Mussolini in the 1920s to explain the status of the fascist Italy. With this, we can say that totalitarian architecture is a translation of totalitarian ideals into the physical sphere of society. There are many governments that do form part of this category, such as the Spain of Francisco Franco, the Mexico of Porfirio Diaz, the Argentina of Jorge Rafael Videla, and the Venezuela of Marcos Pérez Jiménez. On top of this, it is also important to note that there is definitely a duality in the decisions, in the architectural decisions of the dictators. Some of them decide to express their power through the selection of a national style, architectural style, and through the construction of huge buildings. Others decide to show that control and that power through the control of urban planning. First, we will analyze the question of identity, and we will talk about architecture as a means of representation of power. Let's start with talking about Spain, where there's a rejection of the modernist movement and a huge exile of many professionals. First of all, the dictatorship refuses to obey to the modernist movement because it was very innovative, very progressive, and it did represent the Republic. An example of this is the Mercado Comunal de Olot in Madrid, where the construction of this building was interrupted because of the war. And once they resumed it, the National Party went in and just demolished everything that was done by the Republic and started a project from the ground. And then another important thing, talking about the exile, it's the foundation of the Comisiones de Depuración. They're purging, like it's a purge commission pretty much, that were founded in 1939, and they took purge actions against many professionals, and among those there were many architects that did work in name of the Republic. When it comes to style in Spain, the national style that General Francisco Franco decided for Spain was a neo-Herrerian and imperial style. And this logic is based on history and tradition. what he wanted to do is that he wanted to take examples from those masters that made and monuments that made the history of Spain and use them as an example to develop a new national style for the country. This mix of neo-Hungarian and imperial style definitely consolidates the combination nationalist ideology and architecture of the government. As you can see from the picture, it is a very classic and monumental style. Here are some more examples of buildings and monuments of power that follow this same exact style. On the top right, we can see El Ministerio del Aire in Madrid. On the bottom right, we can see the Arco de la Victoria, always in Madrid. And the pictures on the left are pictures of El Colegio Mayor de San Pablo, always in Madrid. As you can see, they all follow this neo-Hungarian imperial style, and that's the way that they're portraying the government and the dictator's power through that classic monumental style. A little bit of a different example when it comes to style and ideology is El Valle de los Caídos, or the Valley of the Fallen. This was an enormous monument that was started right after the end of the Civil War, and it had as a general goal the one to celebrate and remember all of the people that fell during the war. However, given the size and the symbolism that we can find in this monument, it is very easy to notice that the real role of the Valley of the Fallen was the one to be a direct exhibition of the new power acquired by General Francisco Franco. Let's now move over to Mexico. In Mexico, what we see is a push towards modernization. And this is because Porfirio Diaz wanted to create buildings and monuments as images of power, and as images of power of his power specifically. This architecture of monumental scale has the goal of perpetuating memory, the memory of power in history. So it's a mark of Diaz's power in society. Another important thing to note is that during those years, Porfirio Diaz wanted to turn Mexico City into a super modern, progressive city that could be shown to the entire world as a positive example of what modernization can do to a country. When it comes to style in Mexico, we see an eclectic style, always, and it's also, again, always monumental, just like Spain. Eclectic styles, it is a mix of many different architectural languages, such as Art Nouveau, Art Deco, Neoclassical, Neogothical, and Isabellan Gothic styles. One thing that is very important to note about this specific architectural language is it shows a lot of opulence and monumentalism, and these are used again as symbols of power. Buildings and monuments that were built with these specific styles were used as symbols of the regime's legitimation. It's also important to note that Porfirio Diaz really looked towards abroad, towards the foreign, and so there's a lot of influence from outside in the buildings and in the monuments that were built during that area, especially from European cities. These are some examples where you can see that eclectic style coming together into buildings and monuments. On the top left, we have the Palacio de las Comunicaciones. On the top right, we have the Palacio de los Correos, and the pictures around it are the inside of that same edifice. And then at the bottom in the center, we have El Hemiciclo Juárez, where again we can find that eclectic style and a lot of symbolism that remembered that same idea of power and control. Now let's talk about projects of urban planning. And in this part, we will analyze social control through construction and renovation campaigns in various cities. We will start this analysis by talking about Argentina. In Argentina, the dictatorship had a very non-homogeneous impact on the city. There was no interest towards the institution of an architectural language, but the dictator had a very clear idea of city. The city needed to be orderly, clean, and efficient. During this era, all the urban politics and plans that were carried out by the government were quite controversial. However, there was a very clear new ideology on the urban hierarchy, and that means that there needed to be an eradication of popular and industrial sectors in the city. So they needed to be thrown out from the city. For this reason, the dictatorship did prioritize the building of infrastructure for the middle classes and the wealthier sector of society. So when it comes to the explosion of popular and industrial sectors, the way they did it is that when it comes to the popular sectors, so the poorest part of society, they did it by having a liberalization of rent. So rent became so expensive that the poorest part of society could not live in the city anymore. When it comes to the industrial sector, they're just trying to have an idea of city as a residential city and a city of services, and so they decided to limit the industrial activity to the suburbs of the city. For this exact reason, we see a government that prioritizes services for car circulation, for example, and construction plans for green areas. When it comes to car circulation, is because a lot of the poor strata of society did not have access to cars, and so this was a way to push towards that idea of wealth, of residential, and of order and clean. So the impact that such plans had was, first of all of the industrial activities that were traditionally considered harmful were prohibited in the city. This means that there was a restriction of access to work for all the poor part of society. This created a crisis on the industrial field on a national level, but it was very observable in Buenos Aires. And then another outcome of such plans was a very strong ecological and geographical segregation by social class. Now let's talk about Chile. In Chile, what we observe is what we call a repressive urbanism. The dictatorship in Chile wanted to organize the city of Santiago for earnings and income. This plan had a very neoliberal nature because it really stressed the importance of free market and of privatization. The dictator also decided to eliminate the public organization for urban planning, so everything was privatized. And then we see this repressive urbanism in two different forms, institutional and spatial. When it comes to institutional repression, it goes through these new plans that were plans for urban development, and they were carried out between 1979 and 1985. And what they did is that they created a monopoly on development on the basis of free market objectives. This new plan determined that that land was not a scarce resource, that the control of urban development was dependent only on the earnings and income that that same land could generate, and that the use of land was defined in compliance with the market requirements. The only role of the state or of the country was the one to protect the common good. However, this plan did not define what this common good was. So the impact that we see from these new plans are an increase of the price of land, speculation over the same, a very marked residential segregation, a segmentation of the city in accordance with the wealth of that person or family, and we see the popular classes living in spaces of lesser quality. When it comes to spatial repression, the government tried to carry out a very strong eradication of those of the poor, and so it did this through the protection of private property, through the relocalization of such citizens in the suburbs, the segmentation of land. So it created different neighborhoods, so neighborhoods for wealthy people, for middle class, and for poor people. And this neighborhood were operating with full autonomy. That means that they were self-sustained when it comes to finances. It means that the neighborhoods that were had a very high wealthy population did have higher access to services and infrastructure. Now let's talk about Venezuela. In Venezuela, what we see is a strong modernization and industrialization. And this comes thanks to the expansion of the oil industry. At this point in time, Venezuela was a very rich country, and it was mostly thanks to oil money. The government created a new plan called Nuevo Ideal Nacional, through which wanted to transform the physical medium, so the physical space, to better the life of all Venezuelans. During this period, we see impressive engineering works and a lot of new architectural buildings that were all constructed under the control and lead of the military class. Caracas becomes a stage to show the wealth of Venezuela, and that's why we see a lot of new public buildings coming up, and the construction of a lot of new highways, hotels, railroads, universities, malls, etc., etc. It is important to note that in Venezuela in this era, there was a huge emphasis on the quality of execution. When it comes to different plans in Venezuela, we have a Plan de Obras Públicas, so of public works. There's the construction of a lot of housing and the want and need to embellish the city. There's the construction of a lot of highways, like the Autopista Caracas-La Guaira, of new railroads, and of a lot of malls and conference centers. An example of this is El Helicoide, which was it's the building in the picture, and it's a project that started and never got finished, and it was supposed to be a drive-through mall where someone could go shopping without having to leave their car ever. Another plan that was developed in Venezuela during this period, it's the Cerro Piloto, and it's pretty much the eradication of the poor from the city. We are talking about what the government would call a rancho, that were houses that were built by the people coming from the countryside. So they were pretty much immigrants in the city from the countryside, and the government starts a real fight against it. And it does this through the building of what they call super bloques. So they're super blocks. They're apartment complexes that they build for these people to pretty much push them out of the city. We can see an example of superblockers in the picture on the right, and we observe how most of the times they were located very far from the city center, or did not have good access to means of transportation and communication to the industrial areas, which created a lack of social mobility. In conclusion, to summarize what was discussed in this presentation, we can see that architecture is a means of regime legitimation, and it is a symbol of power for many dictators. The many architectural languages had to be impactful, and they had to transcend time and memory. And in this idea, dictators wanted monuments and buildings that were immortal, that could leave a mark of their power and greatness in society. When it comes to urban planning, usually regimes would prioritize the work over the plan, because the most important thing was to execute. And then again, architectural languages and urban plans were used as means of social and political control, because they were manipulating the space in which society would exist. Thank you for your attention, and have a good rest of your day.